Imagine dedicating your entire life to two people, putting your own dreams on hold, rearranging your schedule to take theirs, answering midnight calls, sitting in waiting rooms for hours, and quietly shouldering responsibilities that nobody thanked you for out loud, and then, one ordinary afternoon, discovering that everything you thought was mutual and reciprocal had been decided without you, and that every last thing they owned would go to your brother, not split, not parts of some plan you weren't told about, but entirely, unequivocally, to him. Picture that gut punch, picture the slow, surreal sinking feeling as your world tilts and you realize you were never meant to be included. That is where our story begins, one man's life rearranged by a will, one family's hidden favoritism laid bare, and one decision to act that changed the shape of every relationship in the house he called home. From the outside their household looked ordinary, a regular house in a friendly neighborhood, family dinners, holiday photos, small rituals and routines that felt comforting. Inside, though, there was an undercurrent that the narrator never quite named, a subtle tilt in the way affection and attention moved through the family. His brother, Jason, had always been the type to be noticed, handsome, extroverted, quick to charm. He earned praise for small things and was the center of family stories. The narrator was quieter, the steady hand. He fixed things, handled logistics, showed up when it counted, and rarely asked for anything in return. He did these things naturally, because that's how he loved, because he assumed love was not a ledger to be balanced but a living thing that responded to care. For years he believed that being dependable would be recognized in a way that mattered. He believed in the fairness of family, until the fairness was removed without warning. When his father became ill, the narrator's life contracted and reorganized itself around care. Work schedules were negotiated, days off were taken, and nights were spent in hospital waiting rooms while machines hummed and doctors explained one more statistic, one more possible route toward recovery. He learned to speak the language of medical appointments and insurance claims. He learned how to make decisions when stress made everything fuzzy. He drove his parents to appointments, sat through endless consultations, and handled prescriptions when their hands shook. It was exhausting, and sometimes it was thankless, but he told himself he would do anything for them. He believed the small, private loans of time and patience would compound into something larger, respect, recognition, maybe a sliver of the legacy he imagined they would one day leave. He never suspected that the checks and balances of love could be arbitrarily withdrawn. The first sign that something was amiss came in a throwaway line during dinner, a sentence that landed like gravel in his mouth and refused to be swallowed. His mother, in a tired, distracted tone, said, almost absent-mindedly, that, after the will is finalized, Jason will take care of things. It wasn't malicious. It was the kind of sentence people use to reassure themselves, to imagine continuity, but to him it sounded like a verdict. He did not confront it immediately. He tried to catalog possible explanations. Maybe there was a practical reason. Jason had better financial acumen, lived closer to a bank, had a family who needed more support. Maybe this was a temporary designation, a caretaker role rather than an inheritance. He wanted to believe in explanations that preserved dignity for everyone, but the sentence lodged there, persistent and insistent, and curiosity became a kind of ache. He approached the subject with the same carefulness he used when discussing money with his parents, cautious, respectful, trying not to sound accusatory. "Can I ask about the will?" he said one evening, under the dim light of the kitchen lamp. The conversation that followed felt like a slow unwinding of a tightly wound thread. His father's face, usually an atlas of stoic expressions, softened into an expression the narrator had only seen when people try to cushion a blow they want to deliver without ending the relationship. "We didn't want this to hurt you," his father said, choosing each word as if they were fragile objects. Those words, meant to soften, instead revealed the intention to exclude. The father explained that the house, the savings, the land, and sentimental heirlooms were left to Jason. His reasoning was practical, or so they claimed. Jason's family would benefit. He had children. He had responsibilities that the narrator did not. But practicality, when wielded without the person it affects, can feel like a weapon. He was struck into silence. He did not erupt with fury. Instead, he felt something colder, the numb shock of understanding that the labor he had freely given was invisible in the ledger of their affections. His entire identity, someone whose love was measured through acts of service, felt devalued in a single stroke. He thought of every night he had spent by his father's bedside, every time he had cancelled plans to go home to help, every repair and bill and appointment he handled. He thought of quiet mornings raking leaves, of driving his mother to get groceries when she could no longer manage the stairs, Of the times his brother had been absent and he had carried on, none of it mattered in the calculus of their will. He felt like a ghost in his own family's future. Rather than lash out, he chose a different kind of action. He withdrew, not in dramatic, cinematic fashion, but in small, cumulative steps that removed him from the center of their dependency. He began to say no more often, to decline last-minute requests, to refuse to be the default problem solver. He stopped sleeping in hospital chairs and started sleeping in his own apartment. He refused to be the one always on call. It was as if he had been a column quietly supporting a house and decided to tap the foundation and see if the structure could stand without him. His parents noticed. They accused him of abandoning them, of being cold-hearted. He tried to explain, calmly, without theatrics, that they had made a decision that cut him out, and he would not continue to sacrifice when he had been deemed expendable. He expected confrontation. He expected tears and perhaps anger. He did not expect how small and stunned they looked when responsibility suddenly pointed at a different name on the envelope. Jason's response, when it came, was a complicated mixture of bewilderment and apology. He called, voice cracking at odd moments, to say he had never intended to take everything and that his parents had not consulted him either. He offered to split things after their passing, but words, especially those said in distress after a tense discovery, felt like scaffolding made of paper. They could not hold the load of years of unseen labor. The narrator recognized the difference between intention and accountability. The will was an action already taken. Changing its effect meant altering the consequences of years of implicit agreements. He realized that the only real leverage he had was to change his behavior, his everyday presence, and to demand that responsibility match inheritance. So he set boundaries. He stopped being the automatic caregiver. He told his parents that from that moment on, practical responsibilities would need to be shared proportionally to what the will outlined. If Jason stood to inherit the house, then Jason would be expected to take on more of the logistical and financial responsibilities. It was a dramatic, radical recalibration for a family used to him as a steady, unseen anchor. At first his parents reacted with fear and bewilderment. They were used to comfort, to the quiet hands that smoothed out their lives. They accused him of being cruel, of making them suffer. But he was calm. His voice did not rise. He spoke like someone who had weighed the cost in sleepless nights and hard conversations and decided that dignity was more important than being the easy solution. There were nights when he questioned himself, when his chest tightened with the memory of his father's small, worried face. He worried about being judged by his own conscience as selfish or harsh. He worried about a lonely funeral where he might stand among people who judged his reticence. But those fears did not outweigh the slow-burning recognition that his life had been consumed by an unpaid contract that others had signed without him. He wanted fairness, not spite. He wanted to be recognized as an equal in the eyes of the people who named him their child. This was not about money, at least not only about money, it was about being valued. As months passed and distance grew, the family structure shifted in unexpected ways. Jason, who had lived at a distance and been sheltered from the day-to-day grind, now had to make decisions he had long avoided. He flew in more often than he ever had before, missed work, rearranged his life. He discovered the hidden strains that the narrator had carried for years, the medical bills, the sneaky little tasks that pile up unseen, the paperwork and the phone calls to insurance agents who speak in technicalities that make people's heads spin. Jason had been free to assume he could take these things on when needed because somebody else always had. That assumption shattered. For the first time, the family saw what their default son had done, how many tiny, invisible debts he had paid without mention. The parents, confronted with the reality of their choice, began to show signs of regret that were slow to come but earnest when they arrived. They apologized in a way that was raw and human, late-night calls, attempts to make small amends, letters of regret tucked into envelopes. It wasn't just about their voice saying, "We were wrong," but how they looked at him, an expression he had rarely seen, recognition. They tried to explain. They described their worry for Jason's family, how they feared leaving him with too little. They had grandfather's logic, practical, protective, sometimes painfully short-sighted. They had convinced themselves that they were doing the right thing in their own minds, that material security for the greatest number was a kind of love. But love that erases people is not love, it is selection. Eventually, after much tension, they convened for a serious family meeting. The air in the room felt charged, as if everyone was waiting for something decisive, and perhaps afraid of what that decision might be. The parents admitted their mistake and said they wanted to change the will. The narrator felt a complicated mix of relief and residual pain. He did not leap up and celebrate. He understood that changing a legal document could be done in a day, but altering the patterns that had made him invisible might take years. Still, the act of rewriting the will felt like permission to breathe, a recognition in black and white that he was no longer to be passed over. They agreed to divide assets equitably, to list his name alongside Jason's for the house, and to create a more transparent plan for responsibilities. But even after the will was rewritten and formalized, the narrator kept his boundaries. He understood now that being included on paper was not enough to return to the old ways of disappearing into care. He had learned something crucial about himself, that his worth was not tied to how much he sacrificed. He had cultivated boundaries that allowed him to help without being consumed. He accepted invitations to help, yes, but he did so on his own terms. He set limits and kept them. The family dynamic slowly shifted from being one where he was the unasked for labor to one more balanced, where roles were negotiated rather than assumed. There were painful moments even after change. His parents would have lapses into old patterns, calling him for every little thing at the drop of a hat, because it was what they had always done. Old habits die hard. He would sometimes hear his mother sigh into the phone and feel a pang of guilt, as if his presence mattered more now than it ever had. But he stayed firm. When he said he could only help on weekends or that certain bills were to be handled by Jason, he meant it. Those small acts of self-preservation were not selfish. They were the building blocks of a healthier relationship. They were the proof that he could love without losing himself. People around him reacted, too. Friends noticed he was less frantic, less exhausted. He had time to reconnect with hobbies he had put aside, to pick up projects whose deadlines had been ignored for years because life always demanded more from him. The narrator pursued a quiet renaissance of his own, not flashy, not dramatic, but consistent. He dug his heels into personal growth, therapy, and even financial planning. He stopped relying on the expectation that someday somebody would take care of him and started actively planning his own future. That shift gave him a confidence that was distinct from the vindication he had once craved. He no longer needed proof that he was valued. He now acted like someone who valued himself. Sometimes, late at night, he still replayed the discovery, the moment his mother's casual comment turned into a life-altering realization. He thought about the power of words, how casually uttered phrases can rearrange reality. He thought about fairness and how easily it can be obscured by good intentions that fail to consider consequences. He wondered about other families, about other quiet sacrifices, about how many invisible workers in family systems were denied recognition, and later surprised by the cold legal documents that spelled out their exclusion. He knew now that love without clarity can be cruel, and that clarity without cruelty is a necessity. In the end, the action he took wasn't dramatic revenge or a lawsuit or public shaming. It was a refusal to be erased. It was an insistence on dignity. It was a practical reevaluation of who bears what weight. He didn't want to punish his parents. He wanted them to see him. He wanted his life to be as valid as any other, and by stepping back, by refusing to be the automatic answer to every crisis, he allowed the family to finally redistribute responsibilities the way their will had always implied should happen. He gave Jason a chance to step up. He gave his parents a mirror to see the consequences of their choices. He gave himself permission to live a life not defined by other people's needs. The months that followed were not perfect. There were awkward encounters, awkward apologies, and rekindled misunderstandings. There were quiet moments of tenderness when his father, in a softer voice than he'd used in years, said, "Thank you," for a small thing and actually meant it. There were also visits where old resentments flared, and the narrator had to remind himself why he had taken this path in the first place. But gradually, as the new will took effect and the family's daily life adjusted, there was a new rhythm, one where responsibility and inheritance more closely matched, where roles were explicit instead of assumed, and where affection was not confused with entitlement. The story is less about material inheritance and more about psychological estate, the parts of ourselves we leave unwritten in the hearts of others. He learned to claim his share of respect, to negotiate the terms of his care rather than accept them as default, and to insist that the labor of love he performed be recognized not through promises of future payment but through present recognition and equity. He taught his parents, gently but firmly, that fairness matters and that love without fairness is a wound disguised as kindness. If there's a lesson to be learned here, it's that love does not make people invisible, and kindness does not require self-effacement. Being the one who holds a family together does not obligate you to be the one who is forgotten in the legal fine print. Sometimes, taking action is a quiet thing, an adjustment in how you answer the phone, a refusal to be the default, a redraw of boundaries that says, without malice, I am here. but I will not be consumed. And sometimes, that quiet action forces everyone else to confront the cost of their assumptions. At the end of the day, he did not walk away embittered. He walked away with a new posture, one that allowed him to be generous on his own terms and to be present without being erased. His parents, chastened and regretful, learned to ask and to reciprocate. Jason learned what being responsible really meant, and the narrator, finally found the balance he had wanted all along, to be loved as an equal, to be included in the chapters of the family's future, and to live a life that was his, not simply defined by service, but enriched by it. This story ends not with a tidy resolution but with the quiet knowledge that people can change when confronted with the consequences of their choices. It ends with the narrator standing in his own life, a little bruised but steadier, knowing he had taken action that protected his dignity, recalibrated his relationships, and made room for an honest, fairer future. If you ever find yourself doing everything for people who have decided you are optional, remember this: real love includes fairness. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to insist you be treated like family.